So today we are talking about how to start and stop your threads. For a lot of you, some of this might be review, but you know what, I'll be honest, I was using the messy old bird's nest way of knotting my threads for like the first 20 years that I was sewing. So let's get into it. All right, so I started a hand sewing series a little while ago and I said that I would periodically add to it. One of the comments I got was saying thank you for showing the very small details of what I was doing, because oftentimes when people get instruction, there's a whole bunch of steps that it's just assumed that you know. It's just assumed that you know how to tie a knot on the end of a thread if you're hand sewing and how to tie that thread off again. And so I thought, you know what, that's right. If I'm going to be doing this series, I should really start off with the very beginning basic of how to tie off your threads at the beginning and end of a project. So I have here 4 ways that I tie knots at the beginning and at the end of threads. I did it in embroidery floss so that it would be easy for the camera to pick up, but I did not have the right needle to be pulling embroidery floss through this fabric. So yeah, don't come at me for the crappy seams, okay? Now, like I said, for the first 20 years I sewed, I only really knew one way to tie a knot, and it works. It's a knot that holds, and you know what? It does its job. But it's not the tidiest knot. So we're gonna start with that knot, and then we're gonna work through a few more really nice and tidy ways to just level up the inside of that work and make it so that you don't have to try and hide those knots as much. All right, so my first knot is going to be the bird's nest that I talked about, and most of you probably know it, and if you're wondering what I'm talking about, this is it. I wrap the string around my finger about 3 times, and then I roll it down my finger and pull it tight. That's all there is to it. FYI, I do find it's easier if I lick my finger first. You do with that information what you will. It's a personal choice, I guess. Now, the nice thing about this knot is it's really big, so you don't have to worry about it accidentally popping through your thread if you have a lighter weave fabric, but I mean, it's really big, so it's a little bit harder to hide in your work. I do find that I end up needing some good seam allowance to be able to hide my knot behind, just so that it's not kind of hanging out in my work. All right, the next knot I'm going to show you is called the tailor's knot, or at least that's what I know it as. It probably has a few names. Now, I'm going to pull my thread all the way through so that the end of the tail is between my finger and thumb. Then I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to place the eye of my needle in between my finger and thumb right next to my thread. Then I'm going to pull the thread from that tail and I'm going to wrap it around my needle about 3 times. You can do more if you want a larger knot, but I find that 3 is just fine. Then I'm going to slide those loops down the needle and into my fingers, and then I'm going to pull my needle through. This is a tidy little knot that has never come undone on me, probably why it is preferred by tailors. The next knot I'm going to do is very familiar to you if you sew a lot with a sewing machine, and that is the back stitch. Just like you would stitch back and forth a little bit at the beginning and end of your stitch lines, I'm going to take my needle and I'm going to place it in the center of my first stitch, and then I'm going to bring it back out where that first stitch came out. If you want, you can do more than one of these. I find even one of these is really quite strong. All right, the last knot I'm going to show you is for if you are sewing with a double thread. I'm going to fold my thread in half, and I'm going to take the loop from that fold, and that's what I'm going to thread through my needle. I'm going to pull that all the way so the loop is at the bottom of my thread and the tail ends are up near the needle. Now I'm actually going to insert my needle the opposite way I normally would. Because I'm right-handed, I generally sew from right to left. So for this knot, I'm going to put my needle in from left to right. Then, as you can see, I'll pull that through and I'm left with a nice little loop. And I'm going to bring my needle back through that loop and pull it tight. And then I will continue sewing how I normally would from right to left. And there we go, the 4 ways I will start a thread. Okay, so one thing about this stitch, this is without a doubt, if you're sewing with a double thread, this is the tidiest way to start a thread that I know. However, when you do this, you end up pulling through like 4 ply worth of thread through your sewing hole. So if you're working with a thicker thread on like a finer weave fabric, like the irritation of having to wrestle your needle through the thread might just be more than you really want to deal with. This knot is particularly awesome if you are doing any cross stitch because you're kind of already going through larger holes anyways. But yeah, that's just something to be aware of if you do want to try this knot out. Make sure that you have a thick enough needle that it's going to really sort of lead the way and help guide the thicker thread through. All right, let's look at how we can tie our work off at the end of a seam. I'm gonna switch thread colors here because why not? I have a lot of it. All right, so here is my first seam, such as it is. And I'm going to create just a tiny little extra stitch here, like super, super small. And that is going to allow me to create a tiny little loop. Then I'm going to take my needle and bring that around and through my loop and pull it tight. There we go. Now this next one is similar to that. I'm going to create a loop and make a knot out of that loop, but instead of doing an extra stitch, I'm actually going to loop my thread through the stitch previous to my last one. This is going to give this knot a little bit of extra wiggle room. So depending on what kind of fabric you're using, that might be something that you want. For whatever reason, I like to double knot this one. I just always have. I don't know if it's just habit. I don't remember having one fall apart on me, but I always do it twice. All right, with this one, once again, we are going to utilize our dear friend, the back stitch. Just like if I were using a sewing machine, I'm going to sew back on my seam again, and I like to put my needle about halfway in the middle of a stitch. I like to do that because then I'm pulling my thread through itself. And then I'm going to bring my needle back up through the same hole that that last stitch ended at. And I'm going to do something with this thread. I don't want to just leave it hanging out. And this goes for any knot that you make, really, of the finishing knots. But also if you're starting with a back stitch, this is a really good thing to do at the beginning of your seam, and that is bury your thread. I've got 2 layers of fabric here, and what I want is for the tail of my fabric to wind up in between the 2 layers. So you can see, you can't see my needle on either side. It is in between the 2 layers of fabric. I'm kind of randomly putting it wherever. You'll know where your seam allowance is, or how, it depends on your project where you put it. But I'm going to pull that so that there's a little bit of pucker in my fabric. So it's a little bit too tight. Then I'm going to snip it right next to the fabric. And then when I pull my fabric taut to get rid of that pucker, it gets sucked inside. So that thread is completely hidden inside between my layers of fabric. I do this whenever I can because I find my knots last longer. They don't unravel on me. And it just makes your whole piece that much more cleaner, that much more tidier. All right, last one. Remember that double thread that we had up here? Well, let's pretend that we're going to tie that double thread off. I'm going to cut my needle off, and I am left with my double threads, and I'm simply going to tie a couple of knots. If you really wanted, you could rethread these onto a needle if you wanted to bury that thread. That's totally up to you. I find I end up using this on the back of embroidery work, so it's hidden anyways, and I don't have to worry about it. There we go. I have 4 starts and 4 stops. Let me know in the comments if you have a favorite. Well, there we go. Those are the sewing knots that some I use a lot, some I don't use as much, but they're all the ones that I know, and I hope that was really helpful for you. Maybe you've been sewing for a long time and you found a new knot that you're going to try, or maybe you're just starting out and you really needed a little bit of extra guidance on how to do some hand stitching. So whatever the case is for you, I'm glad that you watched the video today. Thank you so much for joining me, and I will see you next week.